Well, good evening. Welcome to my channel. Some of you have maybe seen my previous channel that I did on nitro to gas conversions. Well, tonight I'm going to do a little video on common problems related to gas engines in our models not starting. There's been a couple of threads in the one forum where I hang out, and the latest one is a guy has purchased a DLE 35RA engine. At least I believe it's an RA, it may be a side exhaust, and can't get it to start. Well, he's a newbie, and unfortunately for some reason, and I don't know why, but newbies, for whatever reason, they get an engine, it doesn't start, the first thing they do is disassemble the engine. Well, I can tell you from experience that there's not really anything inside that engine that would stop it from running. So long as you can turn the engine over freely, you take the muffler off, you take a light, you shine it inside, you take a quick look inside to see if there's any severe damage. And outside of that, these things are about as basic and simple as you can get. So disassembling an engine because it won't start is only going to lead to bigger problems somewhere down the road, particularly if you don't get these bolts tightened down, if there's head bolts, if you don't get them torqued down properly, if you tear gaskets. You could do any number of things that could create even more problems what you're already facing. So for now, right here on, if I can get to that, let me see if I can get the camera over here. So that is a DLE 35RA engine, brand new out of the box. Alright, so this is a model that I'm assembling for one of our other club members, and he has no engine experience, so he's come to me to ask me to set up his airplane for him. So anyway, your DLE engine that you just bought doesn't want to start. Well, great. As I said, disassembling it is the wrong thing to do. So here we have, so this engine here, this is an rcgf version 2 Stinger 30cc twin cylinder. I've got one of these flying in an Ultimate. Beautiful engine, love it. This one here is an rcgf version 1 engine. Again, nice running engine, 30cc. I bought two of these approximately 10 years ago, and back then I started them up and checked them, make sure they ran, everything was great, and then put them away, and they're still waiting to go into the airplane that they were the project that I'm working on and off. So, which leads me to one of the first things that comes up that people suggest. Well, your reed valves under here are dried out or bent or doing something. Well, I ran this engine 10 years ago, and then this past summer in 23, I put some fuel in it, put it on a test stand, and it started up like the day I shut it down. It had a little trouble picking up the fuel because the old fuel was probably just a little gummed, but once it was running, warmed up, cleared out all the ventures, and it ran just perfectly fine. Ran like the day I first bought her. So now this one here, if any of you have ever watched my nitro to gas conversion channel, where I take a nitro engine and I convert it to gasoline, well, this is one of my conversions, and this is just an old ASP 91 nitro 2-stroke that I've converted to run on gasoline, and it runs quite well actually. This is an Evolution carburetor. It is the version 1 Evolution that is non-pumped, so you have to supply muffler tank pressure to get the fuel up. And this here would be the pulse port line. We'll talk more about the pulse port in a little while, which would attach to a carburetor, and for the diaphragm, for the section of the diaphragm for the pumped section. But since this is a muffler pressure type carburetor, but the one thing that all of these engines share in common is that they're all timed to 28 degrees before top dead center. So that means, and your timing is done, get her in the camera here, your timing is done here mechanically by where the magnet is positioned. So as you rotate this around, all right, the magnet comes up, it starts to come up on compression, and as it reaches the sensor, all right, at just about that point there, it will send a pulse to the ignition module to tell it to fire. And currently, at this point, the piston will be at it'll be just before top dead center. So once it rotates to this point, then the piston, as you can see here, the magnet has moved past the sensor pickup. So that's where top dead center will be, is right there. This will be at 28 degrees before top dead center. Now, in doing some research into DLE engines, and I know from previous research, the 20cc DLE has its own version of an ignition module. All right, and for whatever reason, and apparently the 35 engines, I looked in the manual there today, and they are timed at 46 degrees before top dead center. Now, most of the engines that are on the market today, whether they're OS, they're RCGF, they're DAs, they're whatever brand they are, they typically are all timed at 28 degrees before top dead center. And that's important to understand, that it's before top dead center if you're going to try and time an engine. But for whatever reason, DLEs are at 46 degrees before top dead center, and I have no idea why. So basically what that means is I cannot take the ignition from this engine and put it on that DLE 35. Although they're practically exactly the same engine, there are differences in the timing. Now there is firmware in these things. Now what they do with that firmware, why DLE has chosen to go with 46 degrees than basically the standard of 28, I have no idea. But basically what they're doing is they're guaranteeing that you have to go back to DLE and buy their ignition for their engine, or it very likely won't work, and if it does work, it probably won't work very well. So anyway, let's kind of get into some of the reasons why the engines don't start. All right, so buddy on the forum there, he's a newbie. His first engine, he goes out, he shops around, and he finds a great deal for this 35 engine. Well, he gets it home, well, it won't start. His first words were that it wasn't drawing fuel. Okay, well, if it's not drawing fuel, it's possibly had fuel sitting in the carburetor that is gummed up. Just put an electric starter on it, run it over a bunch of times, and it will eventually start to draw fuel, unless there's something very serious wrong in the carburetor. And we'll get into that in a little bit too. So either way, never take your engine apart. So let's have a look at some carburetors and reasons why they don't start and why. So buddy buys his engine. Well, if this guy's selling a nice new 35 engine and for a great price, why is my first question. Why does he probably knows the engine won't start for some reason. Now, why doesn't it start? Who knows? Maybe him and buddy got together, they got tinkering with the engine and they didn't know what they were doing with it, and they swapped carburetors. Well, these carburetors, if I can get them sitting here together nicely. So these carburetors pretty much look identical on the outside. Okay, they're almost identical. in every respect. But the first thing you're going to notice that people don't really catch on to is, if I can get it in the camera the right way, you can get a look. You got to get the right angle. If you can see the size of the hole through there, all right, you can see the size of the throttle barrel, and then look at this one and see the size of the hole. You can see that that is considerably larger throttle hole, okay? And what I have seen, guys, carburetors look exactly the same, but guess what? This one here is actually meant for a 15cc engine. This one is actually meant for a 50cc engine. That's the difference, is the amount of air that can pass through. Now, the amount of air that can pass through, it's not too likely you can see it too well in here. I don't think I can get it into the camera where you can see it, but there's a little venturi right there at the beginning. That is your high speed venturi. So when the throttle is wide open, it's drawing fuel from that one, and it's also drawing fuel from another little venturi on this side of the throttle plate. All right, so when the throttle is closed, all right, then there's a little wee tiny venturi hole right here where it will draw fuel from. So that's for an idle. When the throttle starts to open up, like so, all right, then we get a rush of air coming past this venturi, which starts drawing fuel for your high speed. Now, these carburetors were never designed, they were originally designed for things like weed whackers and chainsaws and stuff like that. They were never designed to be a transitioning carb. So they work not bad, but basically they are designed to work at either idle or full throttle. But through some tinkering, we can get them to work and transition reasonably well. All right, so they work pretty good. But yes, they are, even though they look the same, you know, maybe Buddy has swapped out the carburetor for another carburetor that his buddy gave him. And well, hey, the one he gave him was for a 15cc engine, and he's trying to fit it onto a 35cc engine. Well, it's not going to work well. It really won't. The engine will still start and it'll run, it just won't run well. So that's one thing that you need to kind of look for. Now, looking at carburetors, you notice that with these two, all right, so what do we got here? What have we got? So what we've got here is we have a pulse port right there, okay? And over here in the corresponding location, the pulse port is blocked off. All right, then the reason for that is because the pulse port is internal to the carburetor here, and the engine designers will use one of two ways to get that pulse port. Now, that pulse port is very important to the diaphragm that's down over on this side, okay? Is it pulses that diaphragm that allows fuel into your metering section down in here. We'll pull this cover off and we'll have a look in a minute. So one of the ways engines don't start is if you have an engine like like this one here, all right, has no pulse port, no external pulse port. The pulse port for this engine will be through the reed valve block, through the crankcase, and down into here. And the pulse port from the crankcase will be transferred through this little hole right here. Now, you'll notice on this one here that this still has the same hole. And yes, that is the pulse port, and it's directly connected to this one, to a channel underneath here. In the case of using an external pulse port, typically the gasket will cover this hole and block it off. All right, and if it doesn't, Alright, and the pulse port is not connected to here, that pressure will just blow out here and nothing's going to happen. So you have to kind of take a look at your engine and see that you have a pulse port internal or a pulse port external. So this one is using the internal pulse port. This engine here, as you can see, has an external pulse port, and it has its pulse line that runs up here to the external pulse port on the reed block. Alright, so what that looks like. So here we have your typical reed block. So when the piston's on its way down, it's creating a positive pressure which pushes against these reeds to keep them closed. So that way any pressure is not going to blow back out through your carburetor. And it's going, and because it's creating, the piston's coming down, alright, and it's creating a positive pressure, it is forcing the fuel at that point. If I can show you here, so here you can kind of see a little bit of a raised area of the cylinder. Alright, if I get it angled right. Alright, so this is your intake channel or your intake port to the cylinder. Alright, so the engine has already drawn the fuel in on a negative pulse. In other words, the piston is going up. Now that the fuel is in the crankcase, the piston is on its way down and creating a positive pressure in the crankcase, which pushes that fuel air mixture up through this channel to the top of the piston. So we're not going to really discuss the whole thing of how a two-stroke engine works, but suffice to say, you know, it creates a negative pulse to draw fuel in, and then creates a positive pulse to push the fuel up for the next compression cycle. Now, this will have a gasket either here or here that will close off that internal pulse port, and the external pulse port is now active. Okay, so you got to make sure this line is in good shape. That's the basis of that. If this engine had a carburetor on it and no external pulse port, alright, then those pulses will just be blowing out here if that port is open. If the port is closed by the gasket, it's another problem. You have to make sure that the carburetor is properly aligned with the pulse ports in here if it's internal. Alrighty, so that's pretty much one reason why your engine won't start, is if somebody's been tinkering with the carburetor, they haven't reassembled it correctly, they've plugged the pulse ports, any number of things like that, that can cause your engine not to start. So I gotta have a little drink. Now if we take a look at this carburetor, alright, okay, so let's, alright, just give me a minute here while I disassemble this. And this is something that really you should go to, if you're not familiar with these engines, take it to somebody who knows their way around an engine. Okay, it will save you a lot of time, aggravation, maybe money, because simple stupid things. If you take this apart, alright, there are gaskets, there's a diaphragm under here, alright, and there's a metering needle under here, and that's one of the things that we want to kind of check. It's very, very rare that a metering needle will ever negatively affect an engine, and I may need a little knife blade to get that open. So when doing this, alright, just be really careful that you do not cut the gasket. Alright, that's the one thing you're going to really want to watch you don't do. Dull screwdriver is probably the best way to do it. There we go. Now we got her off. So here we have our diaphragm, and you notice that that one didn't go down, it didn't spring back up. So this diaphragm is getting hard. All right, it should have just sort of popped back up all on its own. There, it comes up a little bit. All right, so this diaphragm has probably gotten hard, and one of the reasons it causes the diaphragm to get hard is the methanol that is in our gasoline. So you go to the pump, at least here in Ontario, Canada, low-grade gas, there's a sticker on the pump that says may contain up to 15% ethanol. It might not, we don't know, but that methanol, or ethanol I guess it is what causes these diaphragms and rubbers to go hard and fail. So it's always a good idea to go and buy good premium fuel and keep the ethanol out of your engines, okay? So there is a gasket under here along with the diaphragm. It's important that they are aligned properly. So the diaphragm's on top, the gasket's on underneath. They're stuck together. I'm not going to try and take them apart. But in here is where you will find, let's get her in the light here. So right here, here's your metering needle. All right, and the diaphragm, the job of the diaphragm is, so you will see here there is like a little bit of a raised button right there. Okay, that raised button comes in contact with this metering needle here, and it causes that metering needle to push down. And this is one of the things you can check, is just come in here with a fine screwdriver and just kind of touch it lightly. All right, just to make sure that everything is moving smoothly and freely, and that the adjustment of this tang is very, very important, in that it typically, it will be, what it should be is, it should be right here. I don't know if I can get in a little closer, right? Right there. So this little tab should be pretty much level with that surface right there. If it's too low, it won't get enough fuel in here. If it's too high, it could potentially flood the engine. So it's a very important adjustment. So removing this is not for the light of heart. When you remove this screw, you might want to make sure you got your finger on this thing, because there is a very tiny little spring in there, and even though it's not a very strong spring, trust me, I have experience, it has enough strength, it can launch itself quite a distance and usually gets lost for good, and you won't find it anymore. So these are just some of the things you can come in and check. Just check your diaphragm, make sure that if anything will stop an engine from drawing fuel. All right, and make sure your needle is working well. So, and that should pretty much cover this side of the carburetor. So if we go over to the other side, now over in this side, okay, you will find your reed valves. So, my arm's getting sore from trying to hold this thing in the right way. Doesn't help that I'm left-handed. So now we pull this off, and again we have gaskets. We've got our reed valves right there, okay? And they are orientated a very, very specific direction. So they do go in a certain way. You can actually put them in backwards. I don't recommend trying it, but you can see a little wee bit of wrinkling in this material. The reed valves look fairly clean and flush, so, and no dirt. So, and in here you will see a filter screen. right up in here. So right in there, there's a filter screen that screens out very fine debris that your tank filter doesn't get. Take a look at that. Make sure it is clean and that fuel can pass through it. Okay, so that pretty much covers the carburetor as to why your engine won't start. Is if the carburetor is not assembled correctly, if it's not aligned on the engine correctly, are you using a negative, or are you using an internal pulse port that is blocked off because of improper assembly? All kinds of things in here that can cause an engine not to run. So let's get back to the next cause. And this cause is most likely the one that will be the culprit. Let's just move that stuff out of the way. I'll reassemble that later. Now, the most likely culprit in a new engine not starting is that right there. That has been the cause of an engine not starting so many times I can't remember. So, and on top of that, there's a little Hall effect transistor up in here. All right, and it's affected by the magnet in the hub, that it turns it on and off. And more times than not, what I've seen is these things, a lot of times when you buy them, they're disassembled. So you have to push the little transistor up into the end of here, and then a little wedge goes in the back here to hold it all together. Well, if you put that transistor in upside down, it will not work. It will not fire your plug. And it's and that has been one of the biggest cases I have found for engines not starting. Is this thing is either a defective or it's been assembled wrong in the factory. So typically, if you want to check your ignition, all right, so what we have here is we have a nice little spark plug, right? So when you go to do this test, make sure that your plug is installed in the cap, because if you pass a magnet over this and it doesn't fire, and it fires without the plug, you can and will most likely damage your ignition module. I have yet to find a bad ignition module. It has always come down to this here. And this thing as well, I've seen engines that wouldn't run real well. They were difficult to start, and when they did start, they didn't run worth a crap. And that transistor can get weak. It can send a very weak pulse to the ignition module, which in turn sends a weak spark to your plug and causes the engine to misfire or not fire at all. And that is another cause, is this thing here. So simple enough. So you can see here on this engine that as we turn the engine over, a simple test is hook everything up, take a plug, put it in the cap, have it out on the bench, alright, and then just simply run your magnet back and forth like this under the sensor, alright. And if it does not fire, okay, then what you can do, and I'm sure everybody's summers, yep, they stick to everything. These little screwdrivers, they have a little magnet in the end, right? So that's a great little tool. So find yourself a magnet, all right, that, for one thing, what you need to do is try the magnet. If it sticks to the one on your engine, all right, it's the wrong polarity. Yes, these sensors are sensitive to north and south pole of the magnet. Potentially the magnet could be installed backwards. I don't think I've ever run into that situation, but in this case, this one here won't work because the magnet is reversed. So it won't fire it. So when you're turning your engine over and it's not firing, all right, you know what you do? You take your engine, take this magnet that's backwards and run it over top of the sensor on the back side. If the spark fires, then you know that the sensor is assembled wrong. Replace the sensor. Simple. Alright, so let's just kind of sort of show you how that works. So what I'm going to do is I've got this sensor and this plug set up for a demo. I'm going to have to turn all the lights off. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pass this magnet over here and it won't fire. I know that right now. So, hey Google, turn off the garage lights. Google's not on the ball today. Hey Google, turn off the bench. So, that's just, now it's totally dark in here. Oh, I gotta find the switch to turn it on. Alright. Hang on a second, something's wrong here. I don't think I got that switch turned on yet. Hey Google, turn on the bench. Oh, there we go. That's what's going on. I don't think I've got it in the camera view here. That's maybe what's wrong. Come on, focus. Got to get her in focus here now. Let's see if that'll work. Alright. Hey Google, turn off the bench. So now by passing this magnet, you can see the spark at the end of the plug right there. So by passing this magnet back and forth, I can create that spark, and that tells me that the ignition is working and the sensor is working. Hey Google, turn on the bench. Okay, so now that we've shown that ignition works, if this magnet is backwards, but there's a reason for that, but typically you run the magnet here like this. If it fires, great, then go to your carburetor. If it doesn't fire, turn the sensor over and pass the magnet over the other side. Hey Google, turn on the garage lights. And if when you pass the magnet over this side and it fires, then you know the sensor's in backwards. So that kind of covers the sensor. What else won't fire? That's pretty much it. You just need a magnet to check your sensor. Let's zoom out here again. Check your sensor. No fire, turn it over. If it fires, this is bad. Alright, if it doesn't fire, period, it could just still get a new one of these. They're cheap. They're like anywhere up to 10 bucks. Get a new one, try it. It's a cheap, easy test. Or go to another ignition, or go to a buddy or something like that. Try that first before you do anything. Like I say, very seldom I've ever found an ignition. I've never actually found a dead ignition. It's always been this sensor that caused an engine not to start. So we've covered the carburetor, the pulse ports, the metering needles. If somebody's tinkered with the engine, okay, then they may have monkeyed with it. You don't even know if it's got the right carburetor on it. But like I say, the ignition, that is the first place I go. Then an engine doesn't start, and if it's weak, yeah, and if it doesn't fire, turn it over, check it. You will diagnose your problem in no time. Do not disassemble your engine, okay? If you're not familiar with engines, take it to somebody who is, and let them help you, all right? Because it'll just save you a lot of grief, all right? Anyway, thanks for watching, and maybe we'll see you again.